It's the only book in the Bible bearing a Gentile name. And for the next 4 weeks, you and I are going to consider God's grace in the book of Ruth. So let me invite you to join me in your Old Testament, the little book of Ruth. You'll find it right after the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then you will find it after the book of Joshua and Judges. Then comes Ruth. Appropriate that the story of Ruth occurs during the period of the Judges, which is one of the darkest days of Israel's history. Gone are the days of the wonderful Exodus under Moses. He's led the people out of Egypt. They've wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, but God has taken care of them every step of the way. He's fed them, He's watered them, He's protected them. Their shoes didn't wear out. They received manna to eat, water from the rock, pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night to guide them. And finally they came to the promised land. Moses died, and God raised up Joshua. And Joshua, in the book of Joshua, records the entrance into the promised land and the conquest, what we call the conquest of the land. But Israel made a fatal mistake. She did not run everybody, all of the pagans who were in Israel in the promised land. She didn't run them out. God said, run them all out, but she failed. She ran some of them out. But Israel wound up over a period of 300 plus years, known as the Judges, after the conquest, of intermingling with the pagans that remained in the land. And that created constant problems for Israel. In fact, Israel was continually led away into idolatry and to the worship of false gods during the period of the Judges. The saddest statement occurs at the very end of the book of Judges, which describes that roughly 350-year period of time between the entrance into the promised land and before the monarchy, before the rise of the kings, when we read these tragic words: everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. You're in a sad situation when everybody does that which is right in their own eyes. That was the period of the Judges. It was a dark and difficult period. And yet, in the middle of that somewhat desert scene, there is the oasis of the book of Ruth. It is the amazing story of God's grace to the nation of Israel, but also to a Gentile by the name of Ruth. And so in Ruth, we read the first chapter and consider this wonderful story and God's lessons for us today and our lives today from the lives of Naomi and Orpah and Ruth, and see what the Lord has to say to us. During the time of the Judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 children and without her husband. She and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention, had visited his people, their needs, by providing them food. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to them, "Each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband." She kissed them, and they wept loudly. They said to her, "We insist on returning with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could later become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. The 2 of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. A good story begins with birth, moves toward marriage, and then concludes and ends in death. The book of Ruth is a good story, but the book of Ruth surprisingly begins in death, moves towards marriage, and ends with a birth. It is one of the most remarkable books of reversal of fortune in all of the Bible. The hero in the book is not Ruth. The hero is not Naomi. The hero is not the man who appears on the scene in chapter 2, the handsome Boaz who is a landowner. No, the hero in the book of Ruth is God. He is the one who orchestrates events and shows His grace and mercy in the midst of turmoil and trial and stress and death. This is the same God who does so with us as well. The book of Ruth is a fascinating book. It begins with a famine in Bethlehem. Naomi and her husband Elimelech lived in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, what a famous little place in Israel. Only about 4 miles on the other side of Jerusalem there. And in idyllic Bethlehem lived Elimelech, whose name means God is my king. And he's a Jewish man, and he's married to his wife Naomi. And they have 2 sons, we're told, as we describe as the story unfolds in the first 5 verses. They have 2 boys, 2 young men, and everything seems to be going pretty well. But there is a famine that hits the land of Bethlehem. And we're not told why, but for whatever reason, Elimelech and Naomi make a decision that they're going to leave Bethlehem. They're going to leave the land of Israel. And they're going to seek out food and a better life in Moab. Now, Moab doesn't mean anything to you, but make sure we understand the backstory, because Moab's relationship to Israel is absolutely important that you understand. If you're standing in Jerusalem and you look east and you go across the Jordan River, and you look over there and you see the oval body of water called the Dead Sea. Picture that in your mind. Well, on the other side of the Dead Sea and on the slopes past that, that's the land of Moab. We're introduced to Moab, first of all, in Genesis chapter 19, because Moab was the location of the little cities of Sodom and Gomorrah that God destroyed. And so already the land of Moab doesn't turn out to be so well in the Bible. Not only that, but Lot, Abraham's nephew, makes his way to Moab and makes his way to Sodom and Gomorrah and that area and lives there. And then when God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot is saved and his wife loses her life because she's too attached. But his daughters and he flee, and they're living in a mountain cave. And we read in the book of Genesis the sordid story there in the Zoar and in the mountain cave hideout. Lot's 2 daughters realize that their father is destitute. They are left with nothing, no hope of marriage, no hope of offspring, which was so important. And so they connive to get their father inebriated, and each daughter goes in to him at night and sleeps with him and becomes pregnant. And one of those pregnant daughters gave birth to a son named Moab. And the descendants of Moab who lived in that area were related to Israel through that incestuous relationship with Lot. Further, later down in the road, in the Exodus generation, when Moses and the people of Israel are coming out of the land of Egypt, they travel by the borders of Moab. And they request of the king of Moab the opportunity to move through their land. They won't take anything. We just need to travel through on our way to the promised land. But the king of Moab hires a false prophet to curse the people of Israel, and he refuses to allow them to travel through the land. Well, the women of Moab, when the men of Israel are camping very close to Moab territory, the women come across into where Israel is camped, and they say to the Israeli men, we're going to be sacrificing to our gods, we're going to be having a big party, and so come join us in the big party. And the stupid men followed the pagan women of Moab, who were worshipers of the pagan god Chemosh, who was the god who required child sacrifice. And the pagan women of Moab caused the men of Israel to not only come to the false worship, but to get involved in immorality with the Moabite women, to the point that finally God said, I've had enough, and God judged them, and 24,000 died under the hand of God's judgment because of Israel's falling into the trap of the Moabite women. A Moabite woman was the last person on earth that a Jewish mother would want her boys to ever marry. They are the ones who are rough and tough and have Harley tattoos on their shoulder. You do not want to be involved with a Moabite woman. And yet, the family moves to Moab, of all places. What in the world do they think is going to happen when they get to Moab? And yet, there they go. And we are told that when they get there, Naomi's husband Elimelech died. She was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. Now, knowing all this history, knowing the backstory, knowing the history, yet what happens? What just was going to be a stay for a while the famine's going on in Israel. We'll come back. We're coming back to Bethlehem, but now her husband dies, and the boys become enamored with 2 Moabite girls, and they marry those girls, and before you know it, a short stay turns into 10 years. But then tragedy continues to strike Naomi's family because both of her boys die. They both died, and we're told in verse 5, Naomi was left without her 2 children and without her husband. Can you imagine the picture? Here is Naomi. She's now destitute. She's in a foreign land. She is an Israeli woman in a pagan land. Her husband has died, and both of her boys have died. And she is left destitute. 9 out of 10 wives will spend time in widowhood. Today, 9 out of 10 wives will spend time in widowhood. 75% of women in America will die single. Those that were married, their husbands will have preceded them in death. 1 out of 2 women who is 65 years of age is going to outlive her husband by 15 years. 1 out of 2. Naomi never dreamed when she went to Moab she would be a widow. She never dreamed when she went to Moab that the unthinkable would happen, that she would bury her 2 sons. Life for her has turned dark. Life for her has turned tragic. But in the midst of all of this, we are told in verse 6 that she and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's needs by providing them food. The city of Bethlehem means house of bread, yet there was famine in Bethlehem. But famine never lasts forever because God is a covenant God who always sees to it that he takes care of his people. And God will always visit his people. I wonder if Elimelech and Naomi had just waited, if they just toughed it out and stayed in Bethlehem and trusted God in the process. Why on earth would you go to Moab? Oh, I know it's beautiful over there, but it's a pagan land. Now look what has happened. And yet, we are told God visited his people. That's an interesting word. It's almost the picture of the doctor making a house call. One day when Bethlehem least expected it, God visited his people and provided bread. And oh, many years later, when people least expected it and we just celebrated it, God would come to Bethlehem and visit his people once again. And so Naomi hears that there's food now back home. Nothing left for her at Moab. Nothing left. And so it's time to journey back to Bethlehem. So she left the place where she'd been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law. They traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. And then they come to the place where X marks the spot. That wonderful, amazing place crossroads in history for Naomi and Ruth. And Naomi said, girls, I got nothing for you. You need to go back. You need to go back. Because if you go with me to Jerusalem, I have no hope of marrying. And because you are foreign women coming into Jerusalem, no Jewish man is going to touch you with a 10-foot pole. You've got no hope of a future either. My life is over, girls. I'm all alone now. You need to go back to Mama. Naomi said, go back to your mother's house. May the Lord show kindness, verse 8, to you as you've shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. Naomi knew that these girls would be destitute with her. No hope of marriage, no hope of a future, at least if you go back to your hometown, to your home country. There's hope. She kissed them and they wept loudly. Hear it on the road, the sorrow, the weeping. We insist on returning with you to your people. But Naomi replied, no, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? I don't have more sons that can become your husbands. Return home. I'm old, too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from marrying? No, my life is much too bitter for you to share. The Lord's hand has turned against me. What you don't realize is perhaps what in Israel is called the law of levirate marriage. When a woman's husband died and they had no children, it was the responsibility of a brother in the family to marry her if he could, in order to raise up a family so that she would not be destitute and so that the family name would go on. That's the short version of the story of the law of levirate marriage. This is what Naomi is talking about and referring to. But she's saying, look, there's just no hope. I'm too old. I don't have any hope of being married again. And even if I did, I have no hope of having sons. And girls, don't wait. You need to go back. The Lord has turned against me. Has He? Some of you today, you look at the circumstances of your life, and this is your testimony. You feel like the Lord's turned against you. You feel like the circumstances in your life that the Lord has turned against you. And you don't know and don't see what God has up His sleeve for you any more than Naomi understood what God had planned up His sleeve for her and for Ruth. But Ruth replies to her that famous line in verse 16, don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. And here it comes. Your God will be my God. There's the biggie. I'll leave my false god of Chemosh, and I will become a follower of the true God, Yahweh. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me. What a remarkable faith and loyal love Ruth has for her mother-in-law. This is almost an unheard of kind of a thing. And yet Ruth is saying to her mother-in-law, I'm not leaving you. Where you go, you're going back to Bethlehem, I'm going with you. My prospects for marriage there are nil, but I'm still going with you. Your people will become my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. May God do so to me and more if I don't fulfill this promise. What a tremendous, tremendous statement on the part of Ruth the Moabitess. And so when Naomi saw Ruth was determined to go with her in verse 18, she stopped talking to her. The two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" The description here in the Hebrew is when they arrived in town. Bethlehem's not a big place. And so the arrival of Naomi and Ruth would immediately be noticed by all of the women in town, and that would create a murmuring and talking and discussion of what's happening. And that's the picture that's being drawn. All the women in the little town are talking about, "Whoa, look who's come back, look who's come home. Is this Naomi?" And they're exclaiming, "Can this be Naomi?" But listen to what Naomi says in verse 20. "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara." The word means bitter. "For the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me?" The word in Hebrew there means the Lord has testified against me. Do you ever feel like God has stepped into the witness box and testified against you? Do you ever feel that way in your life? "God, why are you against me? Why have these things occurred, Lord? Look at all of the tragedy. Look at all of the heartache. Why did you allow all this, God? You have testified against me." Don't spend your life at the complaint counter with God, because you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know the big picture. You don't have a clue what God is doing in the bigger picture of your life and in His purpose for your life. Naomi could only see the bitterness. She could only focus on the emptiness. She couldn't see anything else. And therefore, she turns to those daughters-in-law and says, "Go back." And she says, "The Lord has dealt with me very bitter, very bitterly." If you ever watch Survivor, you remember Jeff Probst at the end of every show. To the person who lost out and was about to be released and about to be gone, you remember his famous line, "I got nothing for you. Head back to camp." Naomi says to Ruth, "I got nothing for you." To Orpah, "I got nothing for you." And now Naomi says to the women, "God says to me, I got nothing for you, Naomi. Might as well head back to Bethlehem. Leftover life to kill. My husband's dead, my sons are dead. I got nothing for you." Oh, but God. You think God's got nothing for you today? You think God's left you in a lurch? You think God's abandoned you? You think the death of a spouse, the death of a child, the loss of health, the loss of a job, or any number of things that can happen. You think God's got nothing for you. Well, that's what Naomi thought. She felt like God had nothing for her. God's abandoned me. God's left me in the lurch. God's ended things. There's no hope for me. God has testified against me. Listen, bitterness skews your perspective on reality. Bitterness causes you to see things that aren't there. You see, Naomi made some mistakes. She made 3 mistakes. She said, "The Lord brought me back empty." Well, wait a minute. She's got Ruth. It's almost like Ruth there by her side, who had already committed to be with her, to go with her. And now Naomi says to all of her former friends, "The Lord has brought me back empty." And it's maybe like Ruth would say, "Well, what am I, chopped liver?" "The Lord has brought me back empty." No, He hasn't, Naomi. You've got Ruth. And oh, wait and see what God is going to do. Number 2, she said, "The Lord has opposed me." That was a mistake as well. No, Ruth in Naomi's life was God's grace. And the return to Bethlehem What appeared to be empty, God is going to work those circumstances where she's actually going to end up full. She went out full, but now she's coming back empty, and that's all she can see. And number 3, she assumed God has afflicted her. And she did not know and realize the loving kindness of God, of how He was about to intervene. The accusation against God, God hasn't done right by you. I've got all these problems. Get over it. You better be careful about picking up the complaint line with God. It's easy to do. When you look at your circumstances, of all people, Naomi had every opportunity, every right to do it. But be very, very careful when you do. Because God is on the verge of doing something great. Verse 22 says, so Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law, and look at how she's described, Ruth the Moabitess. Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. You know what that is? That's called foreshadowing. Barley harvest was late March and April. Barley was the poor man's bread. Wheat was the rich man's bread. The barley was harvested first, and then a month or so later, the wheat was harvested. And the author of Ruth tells us the very last little narrative statement. They come back, oh, don't call me full, call me bitter. I'm Mara, change my name. I've got my daughter-in-law here, Ruth, a Moabitess. But when they arrive, it's the beginning of barley harvest. Something good is going to happen. You see, the book of Ruth is all about the sovereignty of God. It's all about God's authority and His sovereignty in Israel's life, in Naomi's life, in Ruth's life, and in your life, and in my life. God is in sovereign control. Why would you think otherwise? Hasn't He demonstrated that? Hasn't He proven to you He is in control? Hasn't He demonstrated to you His sovereign love and faithfulness to you? Can you stand and bear witness against Him? Would you do like she did, like Naomi did, and say, God has opposed me? God has testified against me? Can anyone stand there and actually say that? No, you cannot. Because God has not testified against you, nor has He opposed you. Because of your salvation through faith in Jesus Christ, all of the promises of God through Christ to you are yes and amen. He has, will, and always shall take care of you. Even when you can't see beyond the graves in Moab, and beyond the emptiness of your life, and beyond the despair of your life, when you can't see beyond that, God is still walking with you. God's faithful. God's faithful to His covenant people Israel. Famine may come, but it won't last forever. God will visit His people. The doctor makes the house call. God shows up in Bethlehem. And it won't be the first time He shows up in Bethlehem either. Oh, wonderful Bethlehem. Go back to Bethlehem. And so they arrive in Bethlehem, and it's the beginning of the barley harvest. And here in Ruth, we see God's redemptive heart. God cares about Israel. God cares about Naomi. God cares about Ruth, who is a pagan. God cares about people. And God is going to demonstrate His amazing, faithful love to all of the characters in the book of Ruth. Do you know what Ruth is? It's the Abrahamic covenant in reverse. What's the Abrahamic covenant? God came to Abraham in Genesis 12 and He said, Abraham, I'm going to bless you, make you a great nation. I'm going to give you a land, a seed, and I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth through you. That's the Abrahamic covenant. God is going to bless the world through Israel. But Ruth is the reversal, in one sense, of the Abrahamic covenant, because the nation of Israel is going to be blessed by a Gentile pagan by the name of Ruth. And that's God. Israel be blessed through a Gentile. The last person on the earth, on the planet, that any Jew would ever think could be a blessing to them would be a pagan Moabite woman. And yet it is Ruth who becomes a follower of the true God and who becomes a blessing, as we will see, to the nation of Israel. Naomi receives God's provision and blessing. She just doesn't see it yet. And God's provision and blessing comes through His instrument, Ruth. And so instead of the nations being blessed through Israel, Israel is blessed through a Gentile. That's God for you. And so the book of Ruth is not over. There's more to come. Prepare yourself for what God is going to do as we come to see His extraordinary grace in your life, in my life, in our church life, demonstrated through the story of Ruth.